Hey everyone, welcome back. So Dave wanted to do an episode on wrestling. He's a big fan, probably as big a wrestling fan as a Bob Dylan fan. And I thought this was really interesting in terms of some things that are happening now with the WWE. Vince McMahon came back and he announced he was coming back to sell the company. And recently, as recently as yesterday, there was a rumor that he was selling to the Saudi Private Wealth Fund, and they just denied that rumor today. But I think no one knows more about wrestling than Dave, and to understand sort of this whole saga, we should start at the beginning with the history of how WWE got to be so powerful and how Vince McMahon got where he is. So Dave, you want to take it away?
Yeah, and this is a developing story as we talk. I mean, we mentioned in the last episode that we are going to do this Vince episode, and we had no idea that the story was going to explode again at the beginning of the year. I mean, we're 2 weeks into January, and this is once again, as Vince resigned last year, it was a big story, and now that he's done a power play and brought himself back onto the board along with some cronies, it's become a big story again. So Vince McMahon is actually he's the most powerful person in wrestling history. He was for pretty much the past 40 years, except for I would say maybe 2 years from 1996 to 1998 when Eric Bischoff led the World Championship Wrestling, WCW. They were the number one company for a 2-year period. But aside from that, I would say from the moment Hulk Hogan won the WWF title in January of 1984 through Vince's resignation last year, he was the most powerful person in the industry and the most powerful person that had ever been in the industry. And the way that happened is actually also fascinating. Like the behind the scenes stories to pro wrestling are really more interesting than the actual wrestling itself. And some people may find the wrestling itself not interesting at all, but the behind the scenes stuff is really fascinating. So it really starts, and I'll try to keep it pretty short, but really from like the 1930s through the 1980s, wrestling was a regional thing, meaning that you didn't have any national promotion. Everyone knows now WWE, it goes around the country, around the world. You didn't have that. You had promotions in particular states, or you may have, even if you had a big state, you'd have 2 or 3 promotions in like the north and south part of state. You had a Florida territory. It was a territorial system. You had a Florida territory. You had a territory in Tennessee run by Nick Gulas. You had territories in Texas and Dallas and San Antonio, and probably the most important or the biggest territory, because where it was located was the New York territory. It was called New York, covered New York, Philadelphia, would go into DC. Was actually the base of the promotion was DC, and that was the Capital Sports. It was run by Vincent J. McMahon, who's also known as Vince Senior, Vincent K. McMahon, the current Vince McMahon's father, and he ran the New York territory, and really it became big starting around I think 1963 when Bruno Sammartino Vince Senior split from the National Wrestling Alliance, which was really a cartel that enforced this system of territories where like you could not go and encroach on someone's territory, because then the National Wrestling Alliance, all the members would then, if you had what was called an outlaw territory, trying to create competition in an area where someone already had the rights to it, you would have the NWA promotions all send over their big wrestlers, and they would try to just shut it down, and pretty successfully. And you'd actually see the wrestlers, anyone who worked for that outlaw promotion would actually be blackballed. And there was even a Justice Department investigation and a consent decree back in, I think, 1956, signed by the National Wrestling Alliance. It was the NWA versus the United States versus the NWA. So in this system, this territorial system, you had Vince McMahon Sr. running the New York territory. In 1982, in 1982, Vince Jr., Vincent K. McMahon, buys this New York territory, which was by then known as the World Wrestling Federation, WWF. It had previously been the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. The name changed in, I think, 1979, but Vince buys it in 1982. And because of the advent of cable television, Vince saw an opportunity to go national. And not only go national to take his promotion national, but because of the type of person he was, his entire goal was to put everyone out of business, all his competitors, all his father's quote unquote friends, everyone. He just wanted to be, he wanted to be a monopoly. And you actually did have probably 10 years earlier, Eddie Einhorn tried to go national. It was the IWA, it failed. You had the advent of cable television was under Ted Turner, and WTBS was the first big station. And their biggest show was Georgia Championship Wrestling, drew huge ratings nationally. And there was talk among the Georgia owners of going national, but they decided they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to compete against their quote unquote friends. Anyway, what ends up actually happening is Vince buys Georgia Championship Wrestling for that TBS slot. Goes on TBS in something called Black Saturday in 1984, and Georgia Championship Wrestling, which had its share, it was drawing millions of viewers. Its fans revolted, called up TBS complaining. Ultimately, Ted Turner and Vince's relationship sours very quickly. Vince ends up selling his rights on TBS to Jim Crockett, who ultimately becomes the last man standing in this war against Vince McMahon. So Vince decides to go national when he buys the company from his father in 1982. Vince has a reputation as being a genius, as having been a genius promoter, but he really never created any stars. He took stars from other promoters. What Vince would do in 1983, he was going around to the various promoters, lowballing them with offers. Some agreed to it, some rejected it. Vince took particular delight in stealing all of Vern Gagne's talent. Vern Gagne ran the Minneapolis, Minnesota territory. It was called American Wrestling Association. And he had the biggest star in wrestling at that point in 1982 and 83, Hulk Hogan. Vince took Hulk Hogan, made Hulk Hogan champion. Vince took Hulk Hogan's opponent from Minneapolis, which was Dr. D. David Schultz. Vince took Mean Gene Okerlund from Vern Gagne. Vince took Roddy Piper from Jim Crockett. Vince brought over all these guys to go national. And he also, you could say, lucked into it. This was probably some of the Vince McMahon genius, if you can call it genius. He had this rock and wrestling connection with Cyndi Lauper, brought in Mr. T, who was, people of a certain age will remember, Mr. T was a cultural phenomenon for a certain point. Mr. T teamed with Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania. Vince put everything on the line, and WrestleMania ended up, in the end, being a big hit. So Vince, that's really what, there was no looking back from that moment on. So what I would say is, when Hulk Hogan won this championship from the Iron Sheik in January '84, from that moment on, Vince McMahon was the most powerful person in wrestling. The WWF championship was the most important championship in wrestling. WWF was major league. Everything else, these territories where you'd have local promotions, those weren't the stars anymore to their fans, because these fans would see Vince ended up getting on NBC once every 6 weeks. Saturday night's main event would replace Saturday Night Live and often do better ratings than Saturday Night Live. And he was on national television for the first time since wrestling in the 1950s was a big hit when TV first came around. So back in 1985, 30 years after wrestling had been off of national television, Vince is back with Saturday night's main event. He hits with WrestleMania. So all of a sudden, wrestling is viewed as something that's like a big fad. Like Hulk Hogan becomes super known culturally, and WWF is the major league. And really, at that point, all these territories start dropping. The only one that survives is Jim Crockett, who ran Mid-Atlantic, which was the Carolinas territory. And he's the one that had bought that hour, or was it 2 hours? Anyway, it ends up being a 2-hour block, 6:05 to 8:05 on TBS, where he can compete with Vince nationally. Jim Crockett has Ric Flair. Jim Crockett has the Road Warriors. Jim Crockett has Dusty Rhodes. So for like a 1 or 2 year period, it's pretty competitive. In fact, he's probably winning ratings when ratings didn't mean that much, maybe even winning in the arenas, live attendance, but where Vince ruled the roost, and what actually ends up probably most putting Jim Crockett out of business is pay-per-view. Vince takes over pay-per-view. Vince and boxing are the only pay-per-view success stories. When pay-per-view was in its infancy, they tried with some concerts. They were all failures. Wrestling's big, boxing's big. Jim Crockett in 1987 decides he's going to enter pay-per-view. And he didn't create his first pay-per-view event was Starrcade 87. Starrcade was pretty much a WrestleMania for the Jim Crockett promotion, which was the NWA at that point. And it had gone back to Starrcade 83 when it was still, a territorial thing. So they had closed circuit television. They didn't have pay-per-view for it. You would see it in that territory. It wasn't across the nation. In 1987, Jim Crockett decides he's going to enter pay-per-view. And not only that, he sees it as he thinks it's going to be, he starts signing big money contracts, counting.
I think you should say these smaller organizations, they kind of folded up because if you take the biggest star from each one and you hire them because you can afford to pay more money because you're on cable, then these sort of become like the minor leagues, and it makes it harder for them to sell tickets. It sort of becomes this reinforcing thing. So if you're selling these pay-per-view events, somebody that you've seen on TV, that feels like a big star versus the local guy. So they can pay more for the better talent they get on TV, and then using that notoriety, they can sell more pay-per-view, right?
Yes, and I mean that's exactly what happened, because fans saw one group of wrestlers as a major league and then their local group as minor league, and minor league is really, for the most part, not going to survive. Memphis survived for decades. You did have some groups that survived, and you even had some areas where WWF could not draw well. Hulk Hogan didn't draw well because they were used to a different type of wrestling. Because Hulk Hogan's whole shtick was, people, when they went to see Hulk Hogan, they went to see him do his leg drop, and then they went to see him pose afterwards. He did a posing routine, and that was the whole thing. So he didn't go in there to have a competitive, hard-hitting, exciting wrestling match. That was wrestling. In fact, Vince McMahon Jr. would refer to it as wrestling, like Southern wrestling, where, and fans would really get into that. That wasn't the WWF thing. It wasn't even the thing for Vince Sr. It was really like Bruno Sammartino was a punch and kick, big guy, slower moving type thing. But yeah, once you had these stars, and in your smaller promotions, if you did have any stars there, they were taken by Vince or Crockett for the time being. But then the fans would look and see, okay, these are minor leagues, we're not going to spend money on them. They died out. Like I said, by the only real competitor Vince had by 86, 87 was Crockett, who was venturing into pay-per-view. Now this is actually a pretty interesting story too. So Crockett's preparing to enter pay-per-view. Starrcade at that point, it's a Thanksgiving tradition. So it's Thanksgiving night, Starrcade 87. Crockett's going to go on pay-per-view. He signs big contracts for Lex Luger, signs big contracts for the Road Warriors. I mean, 6-figure contracts, because he sees all this money coming in from pay-per-view. He knows what Vince is getting. He's like, okay, great. This is the future. Vince says, not so fast. Vince announces, I have a pay-per-view on Thanksgiving Day. The Survivor Series is created. If you've heard of the Survivor Series, it was created to crush Jim Crockett. But so Vince announces the Survivor Series. At first, the cable companies are thrilled. They're like, great, we'll offer a package deal. We'll offer the fans, they can get 2 events for, whatever the price, for, if it's like $20 an event, you get both for $30. They're thinking that's going to be a great day. Jim Crockett even agrees to move his event to the afternoon on Thanksgiving afternoon, because it was a great night for wrestling. Like when you'd go after your Thanksgiving day and you're tired of your time with your family, go out and watch wrestling at 8 o'clock at night. Jim Crockett's willing to do it in the afternoon. Vince says, no, this is not the way it's going to work. Vince says, no, look, you get the Survivor Series or you get Starrcade. You get one or the other. You don't get both. You go with Starrcade. You don't get Survivor Series. Not only will you not get the Survivor Series, you will not get WrestleMania 4 in March when it happens. And at that point in time, the biggest pay-per-view event in history was WrestleMania 3, which had just taken place in March '87, Andre versus Hogan at the the Silverdome in Detroit, Michigan. So every cable company except 5 in the country told Jim Crockett sorry. And so Crockett, lost a ton that day. And not only that, he then scheduled another pay-per-view event for January of '88 called the Bunkhouse Stampede. The cable companies were furious because they got 50% of the revenue. So this was costing them money. They said, no more pay-per-view events against each other. Vince puts on a free program on USA Network called the Royal Rumble. The first televised Royal Rumble was a free show in January of '88, meant to crush the Bunkhouse Stampede, which it did. So in the end, Crockett has these contracts that he can't pay, and he's forced to sell to Ted Turner in late '88. Ted Turner buys Jim Crockett Promotions because at that point, and Crockett, there was a lot of money. He was spending money he didn't have. There were more reasons than just Vince McMahon's predatory practices. But I would say, it was necessary, if not sufficient, measure to put Crockett out of business. Crockett sees that his mother's retirement's at risk. He's got to sell. Sells to Ted Turner. Ted Turner buys Jim Crockett Promotions. What was known as National Wrestling Alliance then becomes WCW, World Championship Wrestling. And then it's still not that competitive against WWF until Monday Night Nitro starts, I think, in '95. Yeah, they bring in Hulk Hogan in '94, which makes them competitive. In 1995, Ted Turner grants Eric Bischoff a live Monday night slot against Monday Night Raw, which is WWF's flagship show. And those are the so-called Monday Night Wars. And like I said, from 1996 through 1998, that period, WCW overtakes WWF as the #1 company in the eyes of fans. And I mean, legitimately, there was at least a year and a half period where WCW was beating WWF, and WWF, I don't want to say was close to being out of business, but whether they'd survive, you didn't know. But WCW made a whole bunch of mistakes and they end up imploding. Vince buys WCW in 2001. So in 2001, he finally, his 17-year goal of crushing all his competitors and becoming the monopoly in this business is reached. He actually appeared on Nitro on a simulcast. He was on both, whether it was TBS or TNT at that point, and USA Network. And Vince owed everything in the industry. And that was the state of things for about 20 years. And what I could say is,
we should mention also, Ted Turner was able to make a go of WCW because he was a billionaire and he had all his cable money, and so he can run it at a loss until it did well, and sort of subsidize it the way that the Fertitta brothers did with the UFC. And at some point, AOL bought Time Warner, and which Turner Broadcasting was a part of, and the AOL people didn't really give a crap about wrestling, and then they sort of got rid of it and sold it to Vince McMahon.
It lost its television spot, which is
right.
a key thing in wrestling. Maybe today.
And we talked about this before, but when I said that I'm a transactional lawyer, some people might think I did real estate closings, but no, like I actually did mergers and acquisitions, and I worked on the AOL Time Warner merger, which at the time was the largest merger in the history of the world. Now it's number 2. Some jerks in Germany that run Vodafone beat me, but
Eh,
uh, I had that bragging right. But yeah, you know, the AOL Time Warner merger is really interesting because AOL was the acquirer, and when it happened, all the top people in every division was AOL. But Time Warner, they're really good business people, and I don't want to say that they run the place like Lord of the Flies, but they're very sharp elbows inside of Time Warner. And within a couple of years after the AOL Time Warner merger, the CEO was still from AOL, but every other AOL guy was replaced by a Time Warner guy. So it was like a bloodbath. And then eventually the CEO.
I heard that's what generally happens. Like one culture crushes another culture in these mergers.
Yeah, so this is like the internet, you know, utopian culture where they thought, you know, this is going to change the world and we're going to make the world a better place. And then you're dealing with real business people with sharp elbows, and they didn't last very long. Yeah, so sorry to interrupt, but
No,
that's
no,
yeah.
you should never apologize for
So
it.
now Vince owns everything. He's the last man standing.
Should also point out though, Ted Turner had a soft spot for wrestling because wrestling was what made TBS, as I mentioned earlier. Georgia Championship Wrestling was the biggest biggest program on cable television for a period of time, and Ted Turner made it known that he would never let wrestling be taken off his station until he lost power in this merger. And then you had people who were in power who didn't like wrestling, who canceled the television slot. Vince ended up buying it $1 million, $2 million. He bought it really cheap for a company that was making, I mean, WCW was making so much money for a few years there. But yeah, so Vince becomes the sole power. You do have independent organizations, particularly you had the rise of Ring of Honor in the early 2000s, and that was a great alternative. But I mean, as far as monopoly power, it was just WWF, which actually then became World Wrestling Entertainment, and now just WWE. And so Vince's power for 20 years, really, there's I want to say a creative drought. I mean, it was like when you're talking about wrestling fans, I mean, this is what creates the vacuum for competition, is that Vince, as a monopolist, just decides, I'm going to give the fans whatever I want to give them, and they're going to have to accept it because they have nowhere else to go. And he's got no competition pushing him to create a better product. So you had 20 years of stuff that's really, I mean, there's always times where you get good storylines, great matches, but it has not been good. And I mean, for 2 decades, it hasn't been good. He fought with fans. John Cena was characterized as a babyface, a good guy. The adult male fans rejected him and would boo him. The women and kids loved him. So you had this tension going on with the fans because they didn't necessarily hate John Cena as a wrestler. They hated his character because it was really juvenile. It was aimed towards kids, and the adults rejected him. Then over the last 6 or 7 years, you had Roman Reigns, also categorized as a babyface, being rejected by fans, and Vince would just fight with them and say, it's too bad, you have to accept what I want to give you. Instead of adjusting and saying, oh, in 2013 and 2014, the fans really took to this guy, Bryan Danielson, called Daniel Bryan. And I mean, they took to him in such a way where they actually hijacked the show, and they forced Vince to change plans because they would hijack every show. They'd cut other wrestlers who were being they were positioned for the main event slot. They'd come out to start working their program, and the crowd would just chant for Daniel Bryan the entire time. And they were doing this every show. So in a very real sense, this was an emotional release, as Daniel Bryan ended up winning the world title at WrestleMania 30. And he only won it because the fans forced the issue. And that was
So
one
let me
time.
ask you this. I don't remember when, but when did WWF go public?
Oh God. I'm not certain. want to, I'm not certain.
Well,
Can-
let me Google it. So, I mean, I think the main thing is that when it was a private organization, Vince can do whatever he wants. But now when it becomes a public company like Microsoft or Google or General Motors, has duties to his shareholders because he sold a part of the company and then he has these duties to the shareholders. And after it became a public company, there was this internal spat with the daughter and the son-in-law who were involved in the company, right? And then at some point, things became public about his past, and he was forced to resign.
But I mean, that's jumping to current day. I would just also point out, just to get us there, and I don't want to take too much time because I don't know if we're boring people, but in this hole arose a competitor in 2019, which is called All Elite Wrestling, AEW. It's owned by Tony Khan, who's the son of the owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars. And he actually has more money than Vince has. And he created this company in 2019 to not compete, well, I would say compete with WWE, but not to, let's say beat WWE. But Tony Khan creates AEW in 2019, and AEW is viewed as this alternative to WWE because it's viewed as a more serious product. I guess the biggest problem wrestling fans have with Vince McMahon is that he's got his idea of wrestling is sports entertainment. He doesn't even call it wrestling. He doesn't want to take it seriously. It's been compared, WWE's product under Vince has been compared to a parody of pro wrestling. And I think that's a great term for it because, parodies can be really close to the real thing at times. They can be pretty good. And there are times when WWE is good, but ultimately, there's always this wink and a nod. And like if you're a wrestling fan, you just want it to be taken seriously. When you go to a movie, you're not told in the middle of the movie that this is a movie. If you're seeing a superhero movie, they don't stop in the middle and say, hey, look, who's going to take this crap seriously? I mean, Batman, he's in a bat outfit, he's not really enemies with guy. They're friends, but with Vince, he kind of throws it in your face. He'll insult your intelligence with the storylines, and you'll have characters who have no consistency. Just they'll be positioned as baby faces or heels as matters of convenience, not as matters of consistent characters. And it all just becomes really hard to take seriously or get emotionally invested in. So into this breach steps AEW, and you have a lot of fans who are like, great. You had the fans fighting with Vince. You had fans showing up at shows and booing and really fighting. Vince would fight back by just continuing on his path. And then with the advent of AEW, what you saw were those fans disappeared because they had an alternative. I was one of those fans. I went to AEW.
Well, also, I think we should mention that in the era of the circuits, and even before that, wrestling used to be legitimate. Like people would have a legitimate wrestling match, but just like people don't watch.
What?
I'm
what? Wait, what?
No, let's say
wrestling was never legitimate, ever legitimate.
There were legitimate back in the age with catch as catch can and submissions and stuff like that.
It was still not legitimate. It was a gambling con back in the day.
Well, they started fixing the fights because money was involved. But when they would do legitimate matches, I mean, sometimes they would go for a very long time, and people weren't really interested in that. So if you go to wrestling championships now,
even those were work.
But like the collegiate wrestling championships,
yes.
No one's in the stands because it's boring. And so, they started with the storylines and things like that to sort of keep people interested. And Vince sort of took it to the next level because at the time he got involved, there were still legitimate wrestlers. Like the Iron Sheik had wrestled in the Olympics, and a lot of guys who knew legitimate submissions and legitimate wrestling. But then it seemed like the fans wanted the Hulk Hogans who were entertaining and didn't know anything. And Vince sort of threw gasoline on that, and a lot of fans didn't appreciate that. And I think
Yeah, there's a distinction between a legitimate wrestler and a performer, and that became widened over time. Like, okay, so back in the day, wrestling wasn't legitimate, but the wrestlers were. And really more important, they had to be, especially the world champion, because there was a time when the championship meant everything. So you'd have people try to double cross the champion. So you had to have a champion who could handle himself, who was called a shooter, or actually a hooker. A shooter was someone who could actually wrestle. A hooker was someone who knew submission holds, who could really take care of himself and hurt someone, injure someone. Like what you would, I mean, a lot of this is from, jujitsu developed from catch as catch can.
Right.
Mitsuyu Maeda was a professional wrestler. He learned a lot of his stuff from catch as catch can, which he then taught to the Gracies. So yeah, that the stuff was legitimate, but what they were doing wasn't legitimate. It was important for them to be viewed as legitimate wrestlers, especially the champion. And then you even like through the Lou Thez era. And then I would say with the advent of Buddy Rogers, who became the National Wrestling Alliance champion, especially Buddy Rogers, because you had a situation even in the 1920s where they decided to put this championship on Wayne Munn, this football player, and he couldn't wrestle, and he ended up getting double crossed by Stanislaus Zabisco, took the title from him. So you always had to be worried about having a champion who could defend himself. But over time,
And prior to the circuits, they would have these carnivals that would go town to town, and that's sort of how the circuits evolved. And sometimes there'd be a wrestling show, and you win $50 if you can stay 5 minutes with the champ. And if you had a really strong farm boy who knew some wrestling, you might have to pay out, and that's why they needed hookers who could like really hurt somebody.
Well, like they may hit you over the head with something. Like if you were giving them too hard a time, like you see someone in the back, they would do that too. They didn't like to pay out. Those were cons too. The whole thing, the entire wrestling business, and this is also it creates the context for Vince McMahon. It's a con man's business, and it's always has been. And Vince is a con man. And it started in the carnivals when, then we had the territorial era. And then, we come to the era of Vince, and then the rise of AEW as competition. AEW is important to the story because what happened was Vince, these 2 years where WCW took over in 1996 to 98, Vince took the lesson that you can't leave room for a competitor, even no matter how weak that competitor might seem. You got to wipe them down. That's it. So Vince, when Tony Khan started this AEW organization, Vince goes to his son-in-law, Triple H, and this is the whole family dynamics. Triple H is a wrestler who is in reality, it was first a storyline, became a reality. He married Vince's daughter, Stephanie. Stephanie McMahon is married to Triple H. His real name is Paul Levesque. Paul Levesque was really powerful, and he was running the WWE developmental territory called NXT. And this NXT had really two primary goals with NXT. Was one, to get wrestlers ready, like green wrestlers, inexperienced wrestlers, ready for the main roster. And two, it was also created to be, in Triple H's image, a more serious wrestling product, so it could be an alternative for the fans who hate watching the WWE main show because of how unserious it is. So Triple H was getting a lot of praise. I mean, NXT was awesome. Like every big NXT show, they were called NXT takeovers, were awesome. I don't think there was one bad one. They were just great shows. But at this point, with the creation of AEW, Vince takes NXT, the weekly television show, off of the WWE network, puts it head to head with Dynamite on Wednesday nights. And the intention was for NXT to crush AEW Dynamite and to nip it in the bud. And it didn't happen. AEW won the war. And Vince couldn't handle it. Vince takes power away from Triple H. I want to say, if you know what you're looking for, he publicly humiliates Triple H, takes wrestlers that Triple H was trying to create characters with, brings them up to the main roster, has them lose immediately or just changes them completely. It's really obvious that he's trying to make NXT. I think part of it was actually like this defense mechanism where Vince wanted to prove that AEW may have beaten NXT, but NXT was nothing more than a AAA minor league product. And that's all you beat, even though the entire intent and the entire belief among WWE and among television insiders, the only people who thought AEW might win this war were some wrestling fans who are like, I think AEW has a chance. Everyone else was like, oh, that's it. WWE, look at all they've got 50 years in the industry. They're the industry leader. Vince is there. They're going to crush him. Didn't happen. Triple H loses power. And so that kind of brings us to the point where we reach Triple H. I should actually mention, and who knows how tied it is to this, but Triple H then suffers a cardiac event. It's very serious. I don't know if it was exactly a heart attack. He's got a pacemaker now, but he almost died. So that's all bringing us to, I think, what is it, like June 2022, July 2022? Yeah, okay, right? Like, when does Stephanie say she's gone?
I'd say it's a few months ago, but
Yeah, no. Okay, I've got it right here. Okay, so on May 20th, 2022, Stephanie says she's taking a leave of absence from WWE. She was chief brand officer. She says she's taking this time to spend it with her family. Great. 2 weeks later, on what is it, June 6th, 2022, in Sports Business Journal, Vince has his underlings say, and this is had to be with Vince's, they wouldn't have said this without his, not only his blessing, but his command. Says Stephanie didn't voluntarily leave. Stephanie was kicked out for doing a bad job. Buries her. I mean, this is the family dynamics here. If any of our viewers, if you watch Succession, it's real life Succession going on for like the last maybe 10, maybe even 15 years going on here with actual members of the family, people who are close to them, you know, you would consider family. I mean, it is really, there's some crazy things that have happened. So that's in June. On June 15th, so June 6th is when Stephanie is buried in the press as being bad at her job. June 15th, we get the first Wall Street Journal piece, the first Wall Street Journal leak, where they mention that there's the board of directors in WWE are probing a $3 million hush payment that Vince made to a woman who was a paralegal who had a consensual affair with him, and apparently was passed on to John Laurinaitis. In any case, this is the first leak in the Wall Street Journal. And what's important here with the leak is clearly it's coming from a member of the board or someone close to the board, right? July 8th, Vince says he's staying on. Like, you can infer that the leak was intended to like push him out, right? He says, I'm not going anywhere. And in fact, he shows up on TV. Wrestling fans prove why they have a negative stereotype of them as they react to this man with enthusiasm, you know, saved for, I don't know, rock stars. Everyone's just standing and cheering as Vince, you know, this guy who's paid, who admits paying this money to someone who, I mean, again, I guess the justification for the people who said, oh, it's no big deal, is that it was a consensual affair. But in any case, in July 8th, we get the second Wall Street Journal piece where they say there's another $12 million paid by Vince to 4 more women. And I think included in this, I'm pretty sure it was a woman.
First female referee was one of them.
No, that's the next story.
Okay.
This, I think one of the women here was an actual wrestler. There was a wrestler. What ended up really looking bad for Vince is one of the women was actually a wrestler who was then given a push, and then she claimed she was demoted after refusing his advances. And that was actually a pretty famous story. People were able to figure out probably who the reference was to. But so we had at this point 14.6 million in hush money payments dating to 2000, from 2006 until now. So Vince at first says, I'm still sticking around. But in July 22nd, Vince says, oh, I'm 77 years old. He acts like it's out of nowhere. There's nothing going on. I'm 77. It's time for me to retire. So Vince announces his retirement. And at this point, Stephanie and Triple H, who had been ousted, are now back. So Stephanie McMahon and Nick Khan, who Vince had brought in years earlier, become co-CEOs. And Triple H is put in as head of creative. He's put in charge of the wrestling product. So I guess when we're trying to determine who's actually making these leaks, you can, I don't want to speculate that they were the ones who did it, but you could talk about who benefited from the leaks. Clearly, there are three people who benefited: Stephanie, Triple H, and Nick Khan. But in any case, that's where we are in July. They take over the product. It actually is doing really well. Both, I mean, the wrestling product itself is getting compliments. Triple H is, it's called booking. Everyone seeing improvements. The business is going well. The stock is doing well. Should also point out that in July, WWE issued what's called, and you can explain more about this, an 8K. And they said, and I don't know if there's a legal distinction here, but they referred to McMahon leaving as a resignation because he called it a retirement. But they write in this 8K that the $14.6 million, even though it's going to be paid by Vince, and they said some of it he still owes, even though it's completely paid by Vince, was company business and should have been reported by the company, and they're going to have to, I guess,
restate their earnings.
So,
yeah. So that's a really weird position to take. And any public company like General Motors or Amazon or whatever, they have to file these quarterly reports, and then they file an annual report called a 10K. But if something happens between those reports that people should know about, they file this thing, it's called an 8K. So, you know, if you're an insider and you know about something, you can't trade on the stock or anything like that. But, you know, if you put out this 8K, it contains the information, and now the information is public and you're sort of off the hook, right? And that's only for things that are important for the corporation. So, you know, somebody resigning, that's important. And I did read that 8K, and it was very strange because it seems that he paid these women out of his pocket, but the position of the company now is that the company should have paid it, because by keeping these women quiet, you know, paying them in exchange for an agreement not to talk about this, that benefited the corporation because the disclosure would harm the corporation. So they said the company should have paid this, and therefore you overstated your
they said the
earnings
company should have
because-
paid it, or the company should have just declared it, because I was not aware that they said the company should have paid it.
Well, it didn't say they should have paid it, but they said that you overstated your earnings because you didn't account for this $14 million that was paid out. Even though he paid it out from his personal funds, that benefited the corporation. So they're saying that should have been a corporate expense. And it's a very poorly worded 8K. I'm sorry, whoever wrote that. Like as a guy who used to write those, I hate to throw you under the bus, but I think it was like intentionally they wrote it intentionally as vague as possible so people couldn't figure out what was going on.
And it was so confusing to me, and I'm still confused by it. As
yeah. Also, I don't remember if I saw this, but when you looked at the 8K, does it say it was filed or it was furnished?
I don't know.
Okay.
I actually would not have taken note of that.
Because when you file something, there's some legal implications that if you do, you know, if you file something and it's incorrect, you face some legal liabilities. But after the wave of terrible things that happened in 2000 with all the companies going bankrupt as a result of the .com boom bust, They came out with something called Reg FD, which is fair disclosure, because they didn't want people passing around this inside information and trading on it or whatever. So they said a lot of this other information needs to be put in an 8K that probably didn't have to before, but it didn't say filed. It said you had to submit an 8K. So when people submit this and they say we're furnishing this, we're not filing it, and no court has ever said it's the same thing. But I think there's this little hope that if I furnish this to the public, I didn't file it with the SEC, then it sort of might make a difference in terms of liability.
Wow. Well,
But people like this fucking paper pusher, he knows a couple of things. He wasn't doing real estate closings.
they know you're perfect for this. But I think in the 8K, they also mentioned that there's, and this is relevant for something that comes up later, but I think they also mentioned in the 8K that there would be a board investigation into Vince. So that kind of brings us to, I guess, December, right? When the Wall Street Journal again broke some more stories. First, they mentioned that Vince is trying to come back, which should have probably scared me more than it did at the time. But I was like, okay. And then I guess the story that came in a few weeks ago, they mentioned this was the two more women story, and this was the sexual assault allegations. One is from and these are not claims that have been filed yet. These were demand letters sent by these women's lawyers. One was Rita Chatterton, who was a referee in the mid 1980s, and she claims that Vince raped her in a limo. And I think we should mention that Vince doesn't deny having had sex with her. He claims it was consensual. And she sent a letter demanding $12 million. And then a second woman, a former spa manager, and the Rita Chatterton alleged rape occurred in New York. She mentioned that. Second woman, a former spa manager, alleged that she was assaulted by Vince in 2011 in California. And she's also been in contact with McMahon's attorney, Jerry McDevitt. I don't know how much she demanded, but we should point out in New York, there's something called the Adult Survivors Act, which provides what's a 1-year look back window for survivors, adult survivors of sexual assault, to bring claims. So until I think they have till about November. If you are an adult survivor, and a lot of times you've been traumatized, which is why they're giving you this time now, this window to look back and bring a claim, you can bring a civil claim, which is what Rita Chatterton is doing. She's bringing a claim based on an alleged rape from 1986. I mean, we're talking, we're going back 40 years, right? Close to it. And the other claim is in California, and California has a similar act. It's called the Sexual Abuse and Cover-Up Accountability Act, which allows the same 1-year look back window, which this second woman's relying on. And I should also note that the spa manager story, and again, it's just an allegation, but there's another allegation out there from a different spa manager, not a sexual assault, but that Vince sent her dick pics, I think was the story. Unwanted dick pics. So, there seems to be a consistent pattern to the behavior. And I just wanted to...
We should mention that you have a certain amount of time generally in each state to bring these actions, whether criminally or civilly. And New York changed the law so that, and maybe this is in response to all these allegations against priests or whatever from the 80s, that will extend the time that you can bring a civil suit. But when they passed the law, they said, okay, it's a year from today. And so that was about to expire, I think in December of last year, or maybe January of this year. So this is why this lady probably sent a demand letter, because you've only got that 1-year window where they extended the statute of limitations to file a suit, but you have to do it within this 1 year.
And just to bring up the legal issues here, in case anyone's wondering, one, Supreme Court has said it's perfectly legitimate to play around with statute of limitations when it relates to these civil claims. And we should also note, even if it was a criminal claim, you can, in fact, extend a statute of limitations even on a criminal claim. What you cannot do, the Supreme Court has said that there's an ex post facto limitation. If a statute of limitation has run out on a criminal, on an alleged criminal act, you cannot revive it. So that would be the one limitation. So these, just to point out, these laws that California and New York have passed have also passed constitutional scrutiny. So these lawsuits can proceed if they actually file them. But one thing we could also talk about is the difficulty of actually proving a lawsuit from so long ago, particularly Rita Chatterton's from 1986. I mean, there's a reason you have statutes of limitations, and part of it is that, I mean, it's just incredibly difficult to prove a case from 40 years ago. First of all, I mean, you talk about witnesses, you have any witnesses, memories fade, and there are just a whole host of evidentiary issues when it comes to that. So even though you are technically allowed to bring these claims, winning them is another story entirely.
Right, so if the statute of limitations criminally, let's say, was for whatever crime, assault was 10 years and 7 years has passed, they can extend that to 20 years. But if it's 10 years and 11 years has passed, they can't now extend it and charge you. Hold on a second.
Yes.
I may have to take a break. My dog is whining here and you probably hear her. Hold on. Yeah, let's take a break and we'll come back. All right.
That's good.